Hi quilting friends, it's time for the second video in our new series dedicated to using leftover 2.5-inch strips of fabric. For this block, we're going to be using our 2.5-inch strips to make a block that will measure 10.5 inches by 10.5 inches or 10 inches finished in a quilt top. Each block can be made with 2 fabrics, or it can be made with 3 if you decide to switch around the center square. The first order of business is to pick out your strips. Pick out any color combination that you like. I started out with a group of blocks from last year. I laid them all out on the table to see all of the colors and fabrics I had already used, and then pulled fabric strips from my bucket that coordinated with the fabrics in the blocks. I tried really hard not to overthink it and not to be afraid to put strips back that didn't work with the other fabrics I'd already picked. I concentrated on picking out florals and wild or fun prints, plus some tone-on-tone or solid-looking prints in clear colors. The solids and tone-on-tones will help the fun fabrics stand out. Other color combinations that I think would be great for this pattern include Christmas fabrics or fall colors, or a two-tone quilt made in either like blue or white, or red and white, or black and white. Once you've finalized your strip selection, you'll need to make the A sets, which include the center square and the outer square. It's one square that's 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches, 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches, and 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 10.5 inches, shown here in the pink. For each A set, you'll need a B set, which is the inner square, made of 2 squares 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches and 2 rectangles measuring 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches, shown here in the green. Now it's time to cut our sets. You'll need a full strip that's 2.5 inches by width of fabric to cut 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 10.5 inches, 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches, and 1 square that's 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches to get a set that's an A set. You can cut each A or B set individually one at a time. The nice thing about cutting them individually is you can match up the A and B sets as you go to get the blocks that you like. It only takes about half a strip to get a B set, which is 2 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches, and 2 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. So out of a full strip, you could get 2 B sets. If you add the A set and the B set together, it equals 1.5 strips needed to make one block. So for every block you plan to make, you'll need 1.5 strips of fabric. Let's say you want to make a baby quilt that measures 40 inches by 50 inches. You need 5 rows of 4 blocks for a total of 20 blocks. If you need 1.5 strips to make one block and you need 20 blocks, you'll take 20 times 1.5 to equal 30 strips of fabric needed to make 20 blocks. So if you have a jelly roll at home, it would easily make a baby quilt if you don't have a bucket of scraps to use. If you want the cutting to go faster, you can layer strips, as many layers as you're comfortable cutting, and cut multiples at once. I start by putting the strips side by side on my mat, and then I'll put 2 to 3 strips layered on top of each other on each of these piles. I have 4 side by side because that's what fits under my 12.5-inch ruler. I did have to stop and press some of these strips before I added them to the pile so that they would lay nice and flat so I could cut easily. The nice thing about this method is it really speeds up the cutting. The downside is if you make a mistake, it's a doozy. So you want to double check as you go along to make sure that you're cutting the right measurements. I cut all of the A sets first, and then I did a bunch of B sets, and then I started matching up my pieces so that I knew how many more A sets I would need and how many more B sets I would need, so I didn't end up with a whole bunch of one and not enough of the other. So as you're cutting, kind of keep track of how many you're cutting at a time. I'm hoping to end up with a quilt that will measure 60 by 80, so I'm going to need 48 blocks. If I take my 48 blocks times 1.5, that means I'm going to need 72 strips of fabric. If you measure 72 strips of fabric that are 2.5 inches wide, you'd end up with about 5 yards of fabric that I'll be using up. So I'm feeling really good about this project. Check the description below for a chart that will give you an estimate of the number of strips you'll need for different sizes of quilts. It'll also tell you the number of blocks needed and the amount of yardage that you'll be using when you make that quilt. This is the second video in our series to help me tame my 2.5-inch scrap bucket. I've got so many ideas for future projects. If you have strips to use up, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe so you can join in the fun. As I'm cutting, I'm pinning B sets to A sets. This helps me stay organized and make sure that I don't lose any of the pieces. Now that I'm done cutting, I'm going to count my pieces and make sure that I have enough to make my quilt top. And I get one more chance to enjoy the pretty color combinations. And if there's any I want to change, now is the time to do it. This is the progression of steps to make each individual block. B squares are sewn to opposite sides of the center A square. Next, the B rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches are sewn onto opposite sides of that unit. And then we add the A 2.5 by 6.5 inch rectangles, and finally the A 2.5 inch by 10.5 inch rectangles. Now it's time to sew. We're going to piece these blocks using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I recommend working on 2 to 4 blocks at one time. Piece matching squares from the B set onto the opposite sides of the A set 2.5 inch square that'll be the middle square. As I picked my 2 blocks to work on, I tried to make sure there were 4 different fabrics to make it a little less confusing for myself. As I send the pieces through the sewing machine, I will cut them off the back side and just keep sewing. After I get both squares sewn onto the opposite sides of the center square, I'm going to finger press and add the 2.5 inch by 6.5 inch rectangles. Once I sew on these 2.5 by 6.5 inch rectangles, I can start another set of 2 blocks so that I'm constantly feeding fabric through the sewing machine and I don't have to stop sewing. This is just an efficient way I've learned to sew, and the nice thing about doing only 2 or 4 blocks at a time is if you tried to send all those squares through, it'd be hard to keep track of which fabrics go with which blocks. So this just helps keep everything together and organized. When I do want to stop sewing to press, I will send a little piece of fabric scrap under the sewing foot to keep the thread in place. It's called a leader or ender. It helps prevent the thread and the fabric from getting sucked down into the bobbin area, and you don't have to raise or lower the presser foot. All the seams for this block will be pressed away from the center square. We're going to add 2.5 by 6.5 inch rectangles onto these units. When adding the next set of 2.5 inch by 6.5 inch rectangles to the center square section, add them to the sides that have the seams. Make sure you're adding the fabric that matches the center square, or if you'd prefer, you could actually add fabric that doesn't match the center square and have 3 different fabrics for a block instead of 2. As I was cutting and sewing some of these fabrics, it was easy to remember the original project that they came from. Other times, I had zero recollection of ever using or owning the fabric. I wondered how they ended up in my scrap bucket. It is fun to finally be using these pieces up and remembering the projects from the past. I just keep sending these pieces through the machine and adding to the blocks and starting new blocks as needed, just to keep the machine humming and my blocks moving forward. I try to sew as long as possible before I have to stop and press. I keep a small iron and pressing mat close to my sewing machine while I'm making the blocks. As I finish 4 or 6 blocks at a time, I will then move to my big ironing board with my big iron and use a little bit of Best Press spray so I can get them nice and flat. The Best Press spray will also help me get rid of the creases that some of these strips have because they were strips that I used for binding, so it'll get rid of all those creases too. You could make single blocks one at a time, or you could make them in sets of 2 and 4 like I'm doing here. Use whatever method is best for you to keep track of your fabric and how they go together. Now that I'm through my first 2 blocks and you've seen how my process works for sewing the pieces together, I'm just going to keep that going until I've sewn through all of my sets. With every set of finished blocks that I add to my pile, it gets taller and taller, and I'm closer and closer to being finished with a quilt top. Now all my quilt blocks are finished. I actually made a few extra because I lost track of how many I was cutting, so I have a total of 54, but my quilt is going to be 48 blocks, 6 across and 8 down. Now it's time to find a place to lay it out and see how you like the blocks when they're all together. You can either use a design board or pin them to a sheet, or I'm just going to put them on the floor and take a look and see how I could get it arranged. As you lay it out, you're going to rotate every other block so that you don't have any seams that have to match up. So you're always going to be sewing 2 seams to a long piece and you don't have to match up seams. Once I lay it out on the floor and get it arranged, I like to take pictures of it with my phone. And then I will look at the quilt on my phone and see what I think stands out to me that I don't like blocks together. And then I rearrange it, I take another picture, I rearrange it, I take another picture, and then I can use my phone and go back and forth to figure out which arrangement I like the best, and then that's the one I go with. Once I have it arranged the way I like, I need to mark each row. So I use safety pins. I put 1 pin in the first row, 2 pins in the second row, 3 pins in the third row, and so on. After I double check that the blocks are rotated correctly, I stack the blocks in order and pin the stack together. Now it's time to sew the blocks together into rows. I keep the blocks in order and unpin just the first row. I will sew block 1 to block 2, block 3 to block 4, and block 5 to block 6. Block 1 has these 2 seams, and then block 2 has no seams on this far left side. And so when you're sewing together the 2 blocks, there aren't any seams to match. Once the rows are sewn together, press blocks with seams towards blocks without seams. If pressed correctly, when you sew the rows to each other, the seams will nest together nicely in the corners. As I finish sewing the rows and pressing, I like to lay it out on the floor to see how it's going to come together. My safety pins are still in the first block of each row, so I know exactly which order to put the rows in. Now it's time to start sewing the rows together. I'm going to start by sewing sets of 2, and then I'll put sets of 2 together to make sets of 4, and then I'll have just one seam at the end. These seams should line up together, and I am going to pin just because it's a little heavier and I want to make sure everything goes through the machine correctly. Once you have all the rows together, it'll be time to do a final pressing before you have the quilt top quilted. I saved all the leftover pieces from all the strips that I cut to make the blocks, and I'm just going to piece these together to make a scrappy binding. Yes, it's a little bit putsy, but I think it's going to turn out really cute on the edge, and I get to use up those strips. That's the most important thing. Now it's time to get it quilted. I'm just going to do a simple pattern of crossed lines and let the machine do all the work. Once it's finished quilting, I'll take it off the quilting machine, trim the edges, and add the binding. And here's the finished quilt made entirely from leftover strips from other projects. I think it turned out fantastic. It measures 60 inches by 80 inches. And the batting I used was Warm and Natural, which is my favorite batting. And the binding on the edge, I used all those little leftover pieces, even the 3-inch and 4-inch ones. Looks really cute. Now that you've seen the front of the quilt, I want to show you the back. I used the 6 extra blocks I had left over from the front and some fabric from my stash to piece the backing. So it's kind of like a 2-sided quilt. I get 2 quilts in one. And the nice thing is the red and the crazy print at the top and the bottom, when I got them out of my stash, I found that they were from 2002. So 21 years later, I'm finally using them in a very special project. We hope we inspired you to get your 2.5-inch strips out and start sewing. The pattern comes from our May Block of the Month from 2022. Check the description below for a link to see the original block. We invite you to hit the like button, share with your quilting friends, leave a comment for us, and be sure to subscribe so you can see all the strip videos we will post in the future. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!